Hi everyone, it's Tom and Shamlin again, and today we'll be talking about Catholic social teaching and economic systems. Specifically, we'll be focusing on what the Catholic Church teaches about each of these individual systems. First, we'll start off by defining some basic systems such as socialism, communism, fascism, and then capitalism. I'd like to start off by discussing Acts chapter 4, verses 32, 34, and 35. This is often a Bible verse that gets used to justify some of the beliefs of some of these different systems. The congregation of believers was one in heart and soul. No one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they shared everything they owned. There were no needy ones among them, because those who owned lands or houses would sell their property, bring the proceeds from the sales, and lay them at the apostles' feet for the distribution to anyone as he had need. And once again, we see a few different elements of teaching here and a few different actions that get misconstrued by different systems when people use a specific verse. And we'll talk about why taking this 100% literally and trying to apply it at every single aspect of an economic life can be problematic. We'll look at socialism as the first of our different options for economic systems. So socialism is defined as an economic system where everyone in society equally owns the factors of production. What are these factors? They include labor, entrepreneurship, capital goods, and natural resources. And socialism is known specifically for allocating these resources using central planning, as in a command economy. This means that essentially the government is dictating what gets made and how do you divide up the labor force, what do you make, what kind of natural resources do you utilize. So there's not really the free aspect of the economy. And the phrase that describes socialism probably the best is from each according to his ability to each according to his contribution. And everyone in society receives a share of the production based on how much each has contributed to making that. And usually this works within existing democratic structures, so this is not something that's necessarily forced upon people, but is usually within that democratic institution. Delving a little bit and briefly into communism, this is the belief that inequality and suffering result directly from capitalism, and that the working class, also known as the proletariat, must rise up against the capitalist owners, and that overall communism does not want there to be any private property, no economic classes, and no profits. Also, communists will state that the capitalist economic and political system must be completely overthrown through revolution. And this aspect of revolution is what we'll see as being a fundamental difference between what the Catholic Church will believe and how an economic system should be formed versus what a communist would say specifically. Moving next into fascism. Overall, there's many different definitions of fascism, but most definitions agree that fascism is overall authoritarian and promotes nationalism at all costs. Most commonly, we associate fascism with Nazi Germany or Italian regimes during World War II especially. And overall, fascism requires some basic allegiance, such as to the nation, to national grandeur, or to a master race or a group. So the key is that there has to be some kind of allegiance to an organization or an idea that is above the individual person. And the core principle is to make the nation stronger, more powerful, larger, more successful. That could also be translated into make the master race stronger, more powerful, larger, more successful, etc. And that overall national strength is really the only thing that makes a nation good. There's no principles of equality or fairness or even economics, for example. It's anything that serves the nation and making the nation more powerful is what is the cornerstone of what fascism believes in. Moving on to capitalism next, we define capitalism as an economic system where private entities own the factors of production and that owners control these factors and that they get their income specifically from the ownership of production. Because the owners control these factors, there's an incentive to maximize the profit, and the incentive is why many capitalists may use the phrase greed is good, because they own it and they're looking out for their own self-interest. And capitalism, it distributes goods and services according to the laws of supply and demand. Specifically, you'll probably remember Adam Smith and his idea of laissez-faire economic theory, saying that government should take a hands-off approach to capitalism, meaning government shouldn't really have any say in what happens in capitalism, that the free market should be dictating what happens based on the laws of supply and demand, and that overall that governments really, if they are to intervene, it should only be to maintain a level playing field, which in a way is sort of a more recent development with like antitrust laws and different things like minimum wages. But we'll talk about some of the nuances of capitalism and specifically what the Catholic Church teaches regarding this. Here's a quick graph that I found that sort of compares all of these different systems side by side and looks at some of the basic differences based on their attributes. So we'll start off by the first row, looking at the factors of production. Capitalism, they're owned by individuals. In socialism, communism, fascism, everyone technically owns them. It's not private property. Factors of production, they're valued in capitalism for the profits. In socialism and communism, these factors of production are valued for their usefulness to peoples. Whereas in fascism, these factors of production are used specifically for nation building and are in service of that greater good. The allocation of these different factors of production and goods, capitalism are by supply and demand, whereas in the other three are by central planning, meaning once again, the government decides exactly what happens to these, how they allocate these different resources. And then looking back at that phrase, from each according to his, the capitalism would say the market decides. Whereas in socialism would be from each according to his ability, and then going to the next row, socialism would be to each according to his contribution. In communism, they would say that from each according to his ability, but to each according to his need. And then for fascism, really doesn't exist because it's all in value to the nation. So once again, with capitalism, it would say from each according to what the market decides and to each according to his wealth, because you're having to purchase those things on the open market, not having the government distribute each of those individual items. Now, going into the Catholic Church's perspective of a lot of this is, I get a good chunk of this analysis specifically from Bishop Robert Barron and his talk, which you can see on Word on Fire and also from the article in the link at the bottom of this slide. I would highly recommend watching pretty much anything that Bishop Robert Barron does. His website is wordonfire.org. And also he's got great YouTube videos on a lot of different aspects of the Catholic religion and how it intersects with the modern society. Once again, great speaker, great talker, very engaging and very good at explaining very complex topics very simply. So I'd highly encourage you to look at pretty much anything that Bishop Robert Barron has to say. And so how he writes in his article is that the Catholic Church teaches against socialism, which is understood as an economic system that denies the legitimacy of private property, undermines the free market, and fosters class struggle between the rich and the poor. Specifically, popes have consistently spoken out against socialism, and that economies in the radically socialist or radically communist mode have proven to be at best inefficient and at worst brutally oppressive. Looking at Pope Pius XI's encyclical titled Quadragesimo Anno, that was written in 1931. The key with this is it was written in light of rising socialist and communist movements, sort of against the rising and sort of unbridled capitalism that left a lot of things for wanting at that time. And specifically in this encyclical, Pope Pius XI writes, "If socialism, like all errors, contains some truth, which moreover the Supreme Pontiffs have never denied, it is based nevertheless on a theory of human society peculiar to itself and irreconcilable with true Christianity. Religious socialism, Christian socialism are contradictory terms. No one can be at the same time a good Catholic and a true socialist." So once again, we're seeing some pretty strong words and a very clear position on the Pope's teaching regarding socialism, and those strong words of you can't be a good Catholic and a true socialist at the same time. Another encyclical going a little bit back in time called Rerum Novarum, written in 1891. Rerum Novarum means of the new things, and specifically on like the rights and duties of capital and labor. We see that is written, private ownership, as we have seen, is the natural right of man, and to exercise that right, especially as members of society, is not only lawful but absolutely necessary. It is lawful, says St. Thomas Aquinas, for a man to hold private property, and it is also necessary for the carrying on of human existence. So we see a very strong encouragement and right of people to have private ownership, going all the way back to St. Thomas Aquinas' teachings, and even before then also. Moving on to another encyclical called Centesimus Annus on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. This was written by Pope John Paul II. And I'm putting all these encyclicals in here to just give you an idea of how much has been written about this from the Catholic Church and its sort of consistent perspectives on the free market and on different economic systems. So Pope John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II writes, "Can it perhaps be said that after the failure of communism, capitalism is a victorious social system, and that capitalism should be the goal of the countries now making efforts to rebuild their economy and society? Is this the model which ought to be proposed to the countries of the Third World, which are searching for a path to true economic and civil progress?" And you see that St. Pope John Paul II is asking some very important questions. After communism fell, there's still a lot of countries that are developing. And what model should they use to develop their economic system, and how do they go forward? How do they build up their countries? How do they build up their societies and their economies to have the greatest good? And you see a very interesting, very searching question from St. Pope John Paul II regarding this. Continuing on, we read St. Pope John Paul II writing, "If by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibilities for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative. But if by capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed within a strong juridical framework, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, and which sees it as a particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical and religious, then the reply is certainly negative." So it's a pretty loaded paragraph here, but it's a very, very deep and interesting paragraph, because he's affirming the positive role of business, the market, private property, but also the key word here is a responsibility for the means of production and free human creativity. Yes, we like those things. We believe that all those things are very positive. However, if those things, the freedom, the profits, the markets, the businesses, are not circumscribed, meaning if it's not following basic rules that exist within sort of a judicial framework, which places humans and at their totality, ethics and religious positive aspects of it, then we don't like that type of capitalism. We want a market that is based within very specific rules that keep people at its center, but still allows for business, free markets, private property, and all of that. And returning back to Bishop Robert Barron's article, we see about free market economies that the Church has consistently advocated for the free market, entrepreneurial enterprise, profit-making, and it holds out against all forms of Marxism and extreme socialism. Free market economies are supported by the Church because they maintain the dignity of the individual and his right to self-determination. And also key is that modern popes have consistently taught that the market functions properly only when it is circumscribed both politically and morally. And so now we're seeing a more nuanced version of this. Notice he's not saying specifically we want only capitalism, but we want a free market that has these specific rules that are both politically there and also morally there. And that still allow the individual to have their own self-determination. So once again, not centrally planned from a government or taken from them, but allows a free market to come, but within the rules that put people at the center. And going back to Rerum Novarum, once again, written in 1891, we see in section 45, "Let the working man and the employer make free agreements, and in particular let them agree freely as to wages, that wages ought not to be insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner." And that's a very interesting statement, because we still have the freedom of employers and a worker to make their own agreements, but the key is that those wages should be sufficient to support an otherwise frugal and well-behaved earner. Once again, so someone who maybe not has all the luxuries in the world, but someone who can get by with at least their basics, and someone who's spending money wisely. And in section 20, we see working for gain is credible, not shameful to a man, since it enables him to earn an honorable livelihood. But to misuse men as though they were things in the pursuit of gain, or to value them solely for their physical powers, that is truly shameful and inhuman. And once again, in 1891, we're seeing the rise of these very industrial areas which don't respect the dignity of people, that don't see the inherent dignity that God gave all of us being enforced in workplaces. And so, once again, the popes are writing very clearly that, working is good. It's not shameful. It's not a bad thing to work, because it allows someone to have that honor, that dignity, to earn their own livelihood, and that people shouldn't be misusing one another in the pursuit of just gain. So once again, not that greed is good and anything goes as long as the free market dictates it, but that these wages, that these agreements, that people are seen for the inherent dignity that God gives them all. Going a little bit more deeply into the political circumscription that, and now Bishop Robert Barron writes, is that popes understand the suffering of those who have been exploited by the market and who have not been given adequate access to its benefits. The church teaching has supported political and legal reforms, including child labor laws, minimum wage requirements, antitrust provisions, workday restrictions, and the right of workers to unionize, etc., and those type of worker rights. And that all of these legal constraints that they have taught should not be construed as erosions of the market, but rather as attempts to make it more humane, more just, and more widely accessible. So once again, there's a lot of different views about things like unions and minimum wage requirements, but the church supports those type of things because it allows people to more justly share in the benefits of what they're doing. And that, once again, it's not taking away anything from the market, but within that sort of political circumscription that recognizes the dignity of a human being, their work, and then overall, all these things make the market more widely accessible to people. And specifically, we can disagree regarding the exact or precise application of these principles, debating, for example, just how high the minimum wage should be fixed, how stringently antitrust laws should be interpreted, just how the rights of labor and capital should be balanced, etc. But overall, the Catholic Church doesn't get into the specifics of it. For example, fixing the minimum wage at a specific number, any of that, but that these laws should exist and that there should at least be some dignity based on the Catholic teaching of there being just wages, enough to live at least frugally and at least within a way that you don't waste money, that there should be sufficient wages to do all of that. Now, once again, the specific number is not what the Catholic Church is trying to get into, but that there should be this foundation for how any free market is run. And now going to the moral circumscription, so not just the political, but the moral circumscription of what the Church teaches that free market economy should be based around, is that a market economy enjoys real legitimacy if and only if it is set in the context of a vibrant moral culture that forms its people within the virtues of fairness, justice, respect for the integrity of the other, and also religion. So once again, the core of any market is going to be the people, and how do we treat people fairly, justly, respectfully, and also within the religious context. This is not just vague moral laws, but also ultimately founded upon the teachings of Jesus Christ and how he treated other people and what his teachings about all of us being equals are. And once again, this is all sort of founded on St. Thomas Aquinas' teachings also, that the ownership of private property is to be allowed, but that the use of that privately held wealth must be directed towards the common good. This is because all the earth and its goods belong finally to God and must therefore be used according to God's purposes. So once again, there's a very strong allowal and encouragement of ownership of private property, but that the use of it should be used for a more common good. But once again, the use is not forced by the government, it's not forced by society, but that it ultimately comes from your heart. But the ownership of the private property is always there. And he brings up a very strong point about, ultimately we are all creations of God. There's nothing that we have that was not first and foremost created by God, and ultimately we must use what we have, those gifts, and return it to God according to his purposes, which includes the use of wealth, the use of our talents, resources, and specifically those factors of production that we discussed earlier. And referring back to Centesimus Annus from St. Pope John Paul II, we read very clearly, he says, a person who is concerned solely or primarily with possessing and enjoying, who is no longer able to control his instincts and passions or to subordinate them by obedience to the truth, cannot be free, so that the ownership of things may become an occasion of growth for him. This growth can be hindered as a result of manipulation by the means of mass communication, which impose fashions and trends of opinion through carefully orchestrated repetition, without it being possible to subject to critical scrutiny the premises on which these fashions and trends are based. And the bolding is my own. It's not in the original encyclical. And I specifically put this in there because, once again, the possessions should be within the control of people. It should not be out of control of people, because it has to ultimately be subordinated to truth. And I put the bolded part, I bolded that part specifically because, this is something that we see very frequently now. The manipulation by means of mass communication, which impose fashions and trends through carefully orchestrated repetition. I put the carefully orchestrated repetition is almost prophetic in a way, because Facebook didn't exist. The kind of advertising that we have now didn't exist when St. Pope John Paul II wrote this, because what do we see when we click on things, for example, on Facebook or on any kind of social media that tracks what you're doing is it's going to keep repeating what you like, and it's a positive feedback loop of, if I click something related to travel, it'll show me advertisements related to travel and then to luggage, and it sort of keeps going from there. And once again, a very sort of prophetic statement from St. Pope John Paul II, and how the growth and the material benefits of a free market can be manipulated into these, because then you'll fall into things that aren't necessarily good for you. So once again, it's a very interesting statement, and I think it's something that we can all use today. Now that we've talked about the basis of the free market and some of the different systems out there, and ultimately these economic systems arise to generate wealth, and now we'll take it a step further to see, well, what is the use of the wealth that we generate from any of these systems? Ultimately, it comes down to almsgiving. Two sayings that very well summarize Catholic social teaching, specifically with regards to the use of wealth. First comes from Pope Leo XIII, who said, "Once the demands of necessity and propriety have been met, the rest that one owns belongs to the poor." And St. Ambrose said, "If a man has 2 shirts in his closet, one belongs to him, the other belongs to the man who has no shirt." I think these are very interesting because neither of them talk about forcing the giving or the sharing of things, but that it allows for private property ownership for each individual, but that the use of it should be directed towards those who don't have as much as one has. But once again, within the context of that private property framework. And with regards to the 2-shirt concept, it's a very simple way of doing it. If you have 2 shirts, well, one is yours and one theoretically belongs to the person who has no shirt. And that's just a very nice illustration of how we should be viewing almsgiving, wealth, and how we share what we have. And returning to the Bible, we go to the book of Tobit, chapter 12, verses 8 and 9, where it says, "Prayer with fasting is good. Almsgiving with righteousness is better than wealth with wickedness. It is better to give alms than to store up gold. For almsgiving saves from death and purges all sin. Those who give alms will enjoy a full life." Once again, very strong words about the use and sort of the generosity that almsgiving has, not only for one giving, but also in terms of getting back what almsgiving gives. But ultimately, what is almsgiving? It implies that a material service is rendered to the poor for Christ's sake. Once again, not just for your own sake, not to get just a fancy name or big letters of your name posted on a building, but given to the poor for Christ's sake, because ultimately all things belong to God. And that almsgiving overall should be discreet, secret, and humble, and doing something like almsgiving renders the donor like unto God. Because ultimately, what is God? God is love, and He loved us into existence by sharing that love with us. And so in a way, we sort of reflect that same creative power when we give of what we have to other people. And almsgiving adds a special efficacy to prayer. Once again, from the book of Tobit, chapter 4, verse 7, it says, "Give alms from your possessions. Do not turn your face away from any of the poor, and God's face will not be turned away from you." And no discussion on almsgiving or charity will be complete without first discussing sort of the age-old question of, well, so then why doesn't the church sell everything it has and give it to the poor? And to begin to answer this question, we must first go to the Bible and John chapter 12, verses 5 to 8. "Why was this oil not sold for 300 days' wages and given to the poor?" He, referring to Judas, said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief and held the money bag and used to steal the contributions. So Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Let her keep this for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." And we see Jesus having a very strong wording to his response to Judas about, well, this is ultimately for his burial. It's not that Jesus didn't want to help the poor. It's not that Jesus didn't want to feed the poor, but that things have meaning, that things have symbolism. And it wasn't the wages that gave, or the value of the perfume that gave the value to Jesus, but that Mary was giving all that she had to Jesus specifically for his anointing, because as we find out later in the Bible, no one really got a chance to anoint him for his burial. And so Jesus says, ultimately that it's not the material things or the value of things that matter, but that it's use in service of what he wants us to use, because ultimately, who do all these pieces of silver and gold and all these perfumes, wealth belong to? It ultimately belongs to God, because it is all his gift for us and to us. So looking at the specifics of the Vatican, we see that the budget in 2013 was 315 million, but its expenditures were 348 million. So overall, large numbers, but much smaller than the other numbers of countries that are out there. And Pope Francis got asked this question, and he has a very nice response to it. Asked whether he has ever felt pressure to sell the treasures of the church, the Pope responded, "This is an easy question. They are not the treasures of the church, but the treasures of humanity. The church's riches are actually treasures that belong to humanity. The church does indeed have a lot of real estate," he continued. "The money is used to maintain the structures of the church and to maintain the many works the church does in needy countries, hospitals, schools." So we see Pope Francis very easily responding to that question, because these treasures, the artwork, the buildings, the churches, all that it has are not, they don't belong just to the church, but that these are artistic treasures or architectural treasures of all humanity that should be shared with other people, not just locked up in private collections or sold away and only allowed to be used by very few people who will be able to own it, but that all of humanity gets to enjoy the talents of those who had created these things. And indeed, that there's a lot that the church does own, but that the money that they raise from it, it's not going into any one person's pocket. It is being used to maintain the many works of, for example, the Catholic Relief Services and the many different charitable arms, the Vatican, like Pope Francis mentioned, the hospitals and the schools and various different things along those lines. So once again, it's the treasures of humanity. It's not just supposed to be belonging to one person. And so, finishing off, we see that gratitude requires that we preserve the gifts of those who have gone before us. Jesus himself expected that we would honor him with our wealth. Once again, not because Jesus needs it, but because honoring Jesus with our wealth shows our detachment from those things. And that, the beauty, for example, the beauty we see in architecture, in the paintings, in the tapestries that we see depicted before us, that beauty leads us to holiness, because ultimately God is love and love is beauty. As Bishop Robert Barron says, beauty is the arrowhead of evangelization, the point with which the evangelist pierces the mind and hearts of those he evangelizes. And it's a very beautiful quote by Bishop Robert Barron. And I think those things are very important to remember, that what we have ultimately means that we preserve the gifts that we've gotten down from us and preserve those for future generations, not just sell them off to give a one-time donation, but allow all those to experience the beauty. And as Jesus also said, the poor you always have with you. I'm not sure if that's more of a reflection of the human condition and us not necessarily giving or being as generous as we can to others, but that he actually recognized that there are things that we need to do to honor him, because it shows a detachment from material things and offering it all back to God ultimately. And so, just in conclusion, what do we see? We see that the Catholic Church very clearly teaches that the free market is a good way of managing and structuring economies, and the free market should enforce the rights of private property, should enforce the ability of people to enter into agreements freely with others for their wages, for utilizing the talents that God has given them, and that it should be circumscribed within a moral and political framework that allows for things like unionization, that allows for minimum wages, that allows for the dignity of human beings and for workers to be upheld, and that this also needs to not just be within the hearts of people, but also within the law books. Specifically, it doesn't get into the specifics what should the minimum wage be? What should these very sort of detailed, nuanced laws be like? But it said that these should be in place to protect the ultimate gift of God, which is human, and which is the dignity and the image of God that everybody has within it. And once we get into the wealth creation and the wealth that we do get from something like the free market, how do we use it? We use it ultimately in service of God. We use it to help others. As that quote said, if you have two shirts, one belongs to you and one belongs to the man who has no shirt. Not forced or taken away from the government in any massive way, but in a way that your heart is oriented towards not the material benefits of your success, but that you're using your success to help other people. But once again, that it's your decision, not forced upon you by somebody else. So I hope you enjoyed this talk. We'll have hopefully more to come. Thank you, and have a good day, and God bless.